Okay, we're working on Chapter 2 of the Hilchos Teshuvah, the laws of Teshuvah in the Rambam, and we're up to paragraph 9, Halacha Tes. So the Rambam says, Teshuvah in Yom Kippur only atone for sins between man and God. For example, a person who ate forbidden food or engaged in forbidden sexual relations and the like. However, sins between man and man, for example, someone who injures a colleague, curses a colleague, steals from him, or the like, will never be forgiven until he gives his colleague what he owes him and appeases him. There are religions that got this wrong. I'm not going to go through them in detail by name, but there's a sense in which Teshuvah has to repair the damage. And there are two sorts of damage, or at least two. Maybe there are three or four. The very fact that a person has performed the transgression means he has violated God's will. That's a failure of obedience between God and man. That has to be repaired. If he, in any way, injured, disadvantaged, hurt another human being, that's another consequence of the crime, and it has to be repaired. What he's calling atonement here requires repairing the damage insofar as you are capable of doing that. Obviously, there are some types of damage that you can't repair, like murder. The shock in Teshuvah is that if you do Teshuvah, then you do relieve yourself of responsibility for what you did, even though there are aspects of what you did that can't be repaired. But anything that can be repaired, you have to repair. In this statement, anything you can repair is a relative statement, because it could be that at one time in your life you could repair something, and at a later time in your life you can't repair it. Then, as we will see, when you do Teshuvah, it's a question of what can you repair at the time when you're doing Teshuvah. The fact that you could have repaired it before, and were guilty in not doing Teshuvah before, when you could have repaired it, doesn't deprive you of the benefits of Teshuvah later. You might have thought it should, but it doesn't. When later, you can't now repair what you did. So when you do Teshuvah, your responsibility is to repair whatever can be repaired at that time. And if the length of time means that some things became unrepairable, that does not deprive you of the ability to do Teshuvah. So let's see. He goes through some examples now. First of all, let me emphasize that even if a person restores the money he owes, let's suppose A owes B money, not necessarily by stealing it. Maybe he injured him. Maybe he damaged his property. There are lots of things a person can do, ending up owing someone money, and he hasn't paid it. So one might dream, okay, I failed because I didn't pay it, so I paid it. No, that's not enough. He has to appease him and ask him to forgive him. Usually, when a person gets hurt, now if you take one standard case where the victim knows who hurt him, so he's angry, he's upset, it's not enough to restore the stolen money or fix the broken item, because the hurt to his feelings is also a damage. Indeed, we have one of the 630 commandments is not to hurt other people's feelings. So that by itself could be a damage. So here, if it's a part of the collateral damage in this particular transgression, then he has to appease him and ask him to forgive him. And even if he didn't do anything physical to him, he just upset him by saying certain things, he must appease him and approach him. It's a little too strong. He has to approach him repeatedly and ask him for forgiveness. Now, let's suppose the victim refuses. What happens then? Watch this process. If his colleague does not desire to forgive him, he should bring a group of 3 of his friends, that is to say, his colleague's friends. So the criminal should bring 3 of the victim's friends with him and approach him with them and request forgiveness. Now, the criminal is confessing in front of 3 other people, which is more difficult, and he's debasing himself, and he's ruining his reputation to a certain extent. He has to do that. If the wrong party is not appeased, he should repeat the process a second and third time. So after having gone in private and asked for forgiveness, he has to come back 3 times, each time with 3 times of his friends. Not sure whether they can be the same friends or different friends. But if after all that, he still does not want to forgive him, then he can leave him alone. At that point, the criminal has fulfilled all of his responsibility. He doesn't have to pursue the matter further. On the contrary, the person who refuses to grant forgiveness is the one who's considered as the sinner. One thing that we learn here from this last law is something which people don't appreciate, I think, and make excuses about. People have responsibility for their feelings. People have responsibility for their feelings, not just their actions, but also their feelings. There's a whole rhetoric, a whole set of slogans that in modern times rejects this idea. You have to be authentic and don't repress anything, and if you repress it here, it'll come out elsewhere, and speak it out, and don't hide, and be honest. Although there is some truth in those remarks, some truth, but there's a lot of damage. In particular, the presupposition behind those mottos, those slogans is, whatever I am is okay. I'm fine. Don't tell me to hold myself back. Don't tell me to condemn myself. Don't tell me to criticize myself. No. You have to take me as I am. That's spiritual suicide. It's also moral suicide. No, you aren't perfect. Yes, you do need to improve. Yes, you do need self-criticism. Yes, guilt is a good thing a lot of the time. Not something to be despised and discarded, the way some schools of psychology will tell you. And in particular, if the victim says, look what he did to me. You don't expect me to forgive him? Forgive him. Not only say I forgive, but actually to forgive him. You don't expect me to forgive him, do you? Yeah, we do. We do expect you to forgive him. That's right. If he comes to you 3 times in front of 3 of your friends and admits that what he did was wrong and asks you for forgiveness, then we expect you to forgive him. And you have trouble doing that, work harder. Don't beg off and say, I'm the victim and therefore no one can tell me what to do. Yeah, we can tell victims what to do. Victims aren't always right, and victims aren't beyond criticism. Now, all of this has one further limitation, and that is, suppose the victim... Oh, sorry, you had a question?
Yeah. Yes, since the reason why the person cannot take the apology, it's because of the feelings it's bringing into him, right?
Right.
So, I mean, when we deal with feelings, it seems to be like, even if you you say, okay, you have to forgive him, but sometimes the feelings are, it's like it's a different realm of fact, so to speak.
It is not. This is the mistake. It is not a different realm of fact. It is not by a category that's beyond your control. That is a mistake. Okay, since you're raising it, I'll go into it a little bit more. Of course, if I tell you that you have responsibility for your feelings, I'm presupposing that it's possible to do something about your feelings. And there is this, how shall I say, common, thoughtless idea that feelings are things that happen to you. And since you don't do them, you have no responsibility for them because you can't control them. Now, when people say that, they have a certain model in their minds. Can I decide to have a different feeling? I'm going to be happy. I'm going to be forgiving. I'm going to be sensitive. Can I just decide to do that? Well, I think the answer is no, though I did have one student here once in 40 years who said he could do it. I think I said, you're from Mars. You're different. I can't identify with you. I can't understand you. But that's not the only model. The fact that your feelings are beyond the reach of a mere decision to feel differently doesn't mean they're beyond your reach altogether. Let's think. Do we have strategies for molding, creating, causing, and dissipating feelings? Do we have strategies to do that? Let's suppose you're planning a party. You have a lot of decisions to make. What time of day or night, lighting, food, drink, inhalation, injection, sorry, and then what kind of music to put on, how many people to invite, how to tell them to dress, which mix of people. One of the things that you're determining when you make those decisions is, what kind of party is it going to be? Is it going to be wild and raucous? Is it going to be calm? Is it going to be just pleasant? Will there be interesting discussion, or will there not be interesting discussion? The decisions of the setting will determine, in some measure, how people will feel when they are participating. There used to be an expression in English. I don't think we do it anymore, but there used to be, "I'm so angry, I'm going to go out and chop wood." That didn't mean, listen, anger gives you a lot of energy, so now's a good time to pile up wood for the winter. No, that's not what it means. What it means is anger requires energy. So if you physically dissipate the energy, you won't feel as angry. You haven't got enough energy to feel that angry. And that's true. People will tell you, I'm so down, I'm going to take a walk in the forest, or I'm going to listen to this music, or I'm going to read this and this poetry, or I'm going to call so-and-so and talk to them, because I know when I do those things, I will feel better. Which means that you can control those feelings. This is the secret to saying that on Shabbos you should be happy, you should have simcha actually, joy, and somebody says, okay, it's Friday afternoon, it's 4:56. In 4 minutes it's sundown. Happy. On the clock. Isn't that utterly unrealistic? No, it isn't, because if you set aside a day where your normal mundane activities are put aside, where you're going to spend the day with people whom you love, you're going to spend the day in prayer and in reciting poetry and in learning interesting ideas and in banqueting, why shouldn't you be happy? You created a little piece of the Garden of Eden for yourself. So the fact of the surroundings, the context, and the activities will indeed cause the emotions of happiness. So emotions aren't beyond our ability to control. Now, you need certain strategies. Love is a very deep and complex emotion. I don't know what justice we can do for it in words, but our literature has recommendations for how you can come to love someone whom you don't love. There's certain things you can do, certain actions you can perform, which will bring you to love him. So when the victim says, as you were saying before, when the victim says, but you don't expect me to forgive him, look what he did to me, and my feelings are hurt and so forth and so on. The fact that that's the way you feel, from our point of view, isn't a justification, and it isn't even an excuse. No, don't feel that way. Change your feelings. Not by snapping your fingers, not by deciding to feel otherwise, but learning the strategies that there are for molding your feelings. And there are such strategies. And you have a responsibility to do that. That's how the Rambam can say that if the criminal comes to the victim 3 times with 3 of his friends and asks for forgiveness, and the victim still refuses to forgive, then the victim now becomes a criminal, becomes a sinner himself. You don't become a sinner if it's impossible for you to do differently. So it is possible to do differently. At this point, we say to the victim, you're overly strict, you're overly unforgiving. There's a very tragic story in the Gemara about a woman who lost her son, and she was crying. And she cried day after day after day. And one of the great rabbis in her neighborhood who heard her crying called her in and said, our tradition says 3 days for crying. After that, 4 more days for sitting and mourning. And after that, in the case of a child, the rest of 30 days for restricting yourself in certain ways to recognizing it. And although there will be pain, after that, you get on with your life. And she kept crying, and he warned her that she's courting a terrible consequence, and something terrible. How either she died or another child died. It was a terrible thing. Now, he couldn't say that to her if it were impossible for her to control how she behaved and how she felt. It is possible to control. And so therefore, it's a responsibility. That's a very important and deep idea here. Now, there are some people that are new here. We mentioned this by the by when this came up but it's important to know that sometimes when you go to the victim and you ask him to forgive you for what you've done, that might hurt him more. That might hurt him more. For example, let's suppose he doesn't know that you did it. And suppose you're in a relationship with him where if you tell him that you did it, he's going to be devastated. You did this to me? So under those conditions, typically, you don't go personally and ask for forgiveness. But you could do it anonymously. Let's say you stole money from him. So you put a bank check in an envelope. The bank check is totally unidentified. And you put in a letter and say, I stole money from you, and this is this money, this much amount of money, and I'm returning it. I'm very sorry that I did it. I hope that you will forgive me. Signed X. Don't sign your name. That way, he hears an apology, he hears a request for forgiveness, and he doesn't have the pain of knowing that it was his son or his brother or a trusted friend who did this to him. So that is the normal way to handle a situation like that. And then you can use that strategy where, let's say, a person stole from a store. And let's say in that jurisdiction, if you steal from a store, they'll put you in jail. That's non-Jewish law. In Jewish law, if you stole and you return what you stole, you don't go to jail. Maybe in that jurisdiction you do. Then you as a Jew don't have to risk going to jail. Because from the point of view of our law, it's not appropriate. But you have to return it, so you do the same thing. You take out a bank check, and you put in an envelope, an anonymous envelope, and you say, I stole from the store, this is how much I stole, I'm very sorry that I did it, and I hope that you'll forgive me, and here's the money, make restitution.
What if it's a corporation?
So it's a very interesting question if it's a corporation. This actually happened in Baltimore many, many years ago. There was a national corporation called Corvettes. Corvettes was a retail store. Corvettes was a short for Korean veterans. And it was the chain, which was nationwide, was founded by 8 Jewish Korean veterans. Nobody knew they were Jewish. Rabbi Heinemann, he should live and be well, in Baltimore, we gave a weekly halacha shir, master of halacha, among other things, made an announcement because he had discovered it, that the owners of Corvettes are Jewish. You should have heard the gasps in the audience because many of the people had credit cards from Corvettes. And if you run up a credit bill, then you're paying interest. And you can't pay interest on a loan to another Jew. You can't do that. And here, if you're going to pay up what you owe, you have to be identified, otherwise you won't get credit for it. So, if they're going to they're looking for you to make you pay. They know you owe it. Here's not a question. So Rabbi Heinemann, I don't know who he consulted with, but this is what he told them to do. Make out 2 checks. One check for the actual amount of money that you owe, that you borrowed, and a second check for what they have calculated as the interest. And write a letter. And in the letter you say, I'm a Jew, and you're Jewish. It's forbidden by Jewish law to pay interest to other Jews. When you borrow money, you can only pay back the principal. This first check is for the principal, and I'm paying you back what I owe you. Here's the second check. Do that as you please. Yeah, it's yours. I'm giving it to you. I'm sorry?
Can you do balance transfer?
Can you do balance? What difference would it make?
You wouldn't owe them the money anymore. You'd owe, instead of owing the Chinese place, you'd owe Chase Bank.
I'm not quite understanding. You don't transfer money to a bank. You transfer money to a bank account.
No, you transfer debt to a different bank. It's called a balance transfer. If you owe one card $1,000
Yeah.
to X, you could transfer it to a different company B, and they'll give you no interest for, let's say, 12 months. That's an option. Is that an option?
I don't know. I've never heard of it. I don't know how it works. I don't know what the consequences are. Somehow, it seems to me that if you owe money through a credit card, and that money includes interest, you will have to pay all that money, including the interest. It's got to come out of your pocket. Otherwise, somebody's losing money there. No one's going to pay your interest for you. So somehow, somewhere, your money has to get to them, I think. So you have to see how they worked it out, going around the corner. But I don't know. I don't know that thing well enough to say.
What Corvettes did? What happened? Did they take the money?
I don't know. I don't know. I just heard about it. I wasn't there at the time. It's after I had left Baltimore. Okay, now what about the idea if the person is your teacher? So here there are two things to say. First of all this presupposes that the criminal is sincere. If there's good reason to think that he's not sincere, then the victim is not required to forgive him. He doesn't deserve forgiveness at all. The halacha doesn't mention that. Maybe because the halacha doesn't trust the victim to be objective in this matter. You can imagine why the victim, nursing his hurt, would be tempted to say he doesn't really mean it. Could be that his Rebbe is someone who, because he has that stature, because he knows the person well, because he invested in him, knows better and can make an objective judgment as to whether he means it or not. I saw this when my Rebbe in Boston. I had an astonishing experience, including my own short-sightedness. It was Elul, this was 30 years ago. And someone was saying in public that the Boston Rebbe will not be forgiven for his sins on Yom Kippur this year. I happen to be a Talmud, a disciple of the Boston Rebbe. So he said it in my presence. I said, "What are you talking about? How can you say such a thing?" I'll tell you why. Because I did something wrong to him, and I went to him, and I asked him for forgiveness, and he refused to forgive me. And someone who refuses to forgive won't be forgiven by God. So I said to him, "You must be wrong." I mean, I know my Rebbe. My Rebbe is kind and considerate and generous, and you must have misunderstood him. There must be something wrong. No, he for sure refused to forgive me. So I went to the Rebbe and I asked. And the Rebbe said, "Yes, I refused to forgive him." I said, "Really? Why did you do that?" And he said, "Because he didn't mean it." Oh. Then I thought to myself, hang on. This guy is going around and publicizing that the Boston Rebbe is not going to be forgiven in Yom Kippur. What kind of guy is he? Is he really contrite over the crime that he committed against the Rebbe? Doesn't sound like it, actually. Sounds like he's got a number of significant moral failings which are being expressed in this case. I should have figured out myself that if he could say something like that in public, he surely wasn't sincere in asking for forgiveness. He should be embarrassed. He should feel that he wronged a great person, and he should live in self-condemnation. No, he's publicizing the fact that the Boston Rebbe is going to be a failure. So a Rebbe can be trusted to do that. That's one thing. Then there's a second thing. There's a certain incident in the Torah. Well, it's fairly famous. It's the reason Moses was denied entry into the land of Israel, because the people didn't have water, and God told him to speak to a rock, and he hit the rock, or he criticized them in a bitter way. There are different explanations of what Moses' crime was in that case. Now, the people, when they made their request for water, were very clear that they had no complaints against God. They complained against Moses' leadership. We are a vast number, we, and our children, also our animals, and you're not providing water. Hello? Are you in touch with what's going on? Why aren't you providing us with water? Their animus was directed only at Moses. It's consistent up until the last words. And in the last words, it says, they fought with Hashem. You look back to the story, there's not a hint to that. Nothing. Not a hint. So, the sages of the Talmud said, from here you see that if you fight with your Rebbe, it's accounted to you as if you're fighting with God. Oh ho, it's an as if. Now an as if is not a throwaway, it's not just poetry. It means that if you analyze it in spiritual terms, you'll see that there's a hidden dimension here which makes the event much more significant than you thought. Who is your Rebbe? Not the person who taught you weaving, not even the person who taught you differential equations, not the person who taught you how to speak in Chinese. Your Rebbe is the person who taught you Torah. Torah is the will of the Creator. Torah is what determines the value of your whole future, the value of your whole efforts as a living person. And he taught you this. He made it possible for you to achieve the most important goals in your life. And you wronged him in some way? You did? Really? Why didn't you think about who you're wronging and what its significance is? So asking for forgiveness from your neighbor is not like asking for forgiveness from your Rebbe. It may very well be that the Rebbe discerns in the person's in the criminal's behavior. Well, let's see. I did this. What does it say in the rule book? Oh, it says ask for I have to ask for forgiveness. Okay. Hello. Hi. Nice to see you. Do you forgive me? That's not what's required. When you sin against your Rebbe, that's not what's required. Something much deeper is required. So with respect to the Rebbe, there's no limit. He can determine how many times you should return, and the limit of 3, beyond which the criminal is no longer responsible to try, doesn't apply if the victim is the person's Rebbe. That's because of the significance of the crime in that case. Are we together? Okay. Let's go on. Paragraph 10. Now he's elaborating on what he said about the victim who refuses to forgive. It is forbidden for a person to be cruel and refuse to be appeased. Rather, he should be easily pacified, but hard to anger. When the person who wronged him asks for forgiveness, he should forgive him with a complete heart and a willing spirit. Even if he aggravated and wronged him severely, he should not seek revenge or bear a grudge. So here the responsibility, and there's a responsibility again not to say you forgive, but to really forgive. Now, the Rambam here is quoting a Mishnah talking about the characteristics people have with respect to anger. And the Mishnah stresses what triggers your anger and what pacifies your anger. And you end up with 4 categories because the person may be either easy or hard to trigger, and may be either easy or hard to pacify. So that gives you 4 combinations. The ideal is to be hard to trigger and easy to pacify. Now, there is a big discussion in our sources, including the Rambam, as to whether we are allowed angry feeling or only angry behavior. There are those, the Rambam among them, who say that you're not permitted to feel angry at all. You're permitted to show anger. That can be, can have a very useful purpose under certain circumstances, but not to feel it. Here, I want to point this out because I think there's considerable misunderstanding about this. In Hilchos, which means the laws of character traits, how you build your character, we are responsible not only for our actions, but for building our own character. Character traits typically are on a continuum of intensity, and usually the 2 extremes of the continuum are bad, and somewhere in the middle is good. So, if you talk about a person who has to spend money, and there are people who can't spend money even on themselves. You probably have heard of people who die in utter poverty, and when they find the dead body, they find $250,000 in cash stuffed in the mattress. He couldn't buy medicine for himself. He couldn't buy winter clothes for himself. He couldn't spend the money. That's a sickness. There are other people at the other extreme who can't hold on to $1. You give it to them at 10 o'clock, by 11 o'clock it's gone. They can't hold on to money. That's also a sickness. With respect to money, being able to make purchases which are necessary for some good purpose is something that you need to be able to do, and the other things you need to be able to hold on to your money. Somewhere in the middle. Most character traits are on that kind of a continuum where there's too little, too much, and some kind of middle ground which is appropriate, but not all. By the way, this structure of a continuum was taken from Aristotle. But not all. The two exceptions that Maimonides mentions are anger and pride. Anger and pride, the correct position is to be on the extreme of having zero expression of the two of them. Now, I believe it's very significant that, I hope I get this right, pride is forbidden by verses in the Torah, the Tanakh, and anger is forbidden by the rabbis. So I believe the Rambam is sending a signal. Was Aristotle a great thinker? Sure was. Do I accept anything on Aristotle's authority? No. Zero. Nothing. As he says in his introduction to the laws of the new moon, he says, any thinker who presents information for which there is adequate reasoning, you don't trust him, you trust the reasoning. You go through his reasoning, if you see the reasoning is correct, you trust what he says, not because he has authority and you're committed to do what he says because he said it. No, he presented a good argument and you went through it, you saw it was a good argument, you accepted it on the basis of the logic of the argument. Here, what the Rambam is saying is, here's Aristotle's structure. I decide whether it works or doesn't work. What do you mean I decide? I have a whole tradition. I have the whole of the written Torah and the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and I have the whole of the oral tradition, and that's when I decide whether his structure of too little, too much, and a middle ground is an appropriate structure or not. And he gives one example where what contradicts that structure is written in the verses of the Tanakh, and another one which is on the basis of the rabbinic tradition, by which he means to say that if it contradicts the revelation from God and it contradicts the rabbinic tradition, either one, then it's wrong, capital W. I'll just reject it. I think it's a very, very important message. So, here when he says a person should be hard to anger and easy to pacify, that doesn't mean that, so that means 5% anger is okay. No. A person at least should be hard to anger. But the ideal is that he should have no anger at all. That he himself says in Hilchos Deos. And he points out that this is a traditional, typical trait of Jewish people. The path of the seed of Israel and the upright spirit, in contrast, is to the insensitive Gentiles. Do not act in this manner. Rather, the wrath is preserved forever, the Goyim. Similarly, because the Gibeonites did not forgive and refused to be appeased, the verse describes them as the Gibeonites are not among the children of Israel because they're holding a grudge and they're not willing to be appeased. So the Jews committed a crime against them and they demanded an extraordinary vengeance, including killing people, before they would give up their anger. Now, here's an example of what I told you before, in 11. A person wronged a colleague, and the latter died before he could ask him for forgiveness. Well, that's one of the requirements, as we saw. One of the requirements is to ask him for forgiveness, and he's dead. So, he should take 10 people and say the following while they're standing before the colleague's grave. I have sinned against God, the Lord of Israel, and against this person by doing the following to him. Okay, if you've been paying attention, what's missing here? He doesn't say, and please forgive me, to what? To the soul? We believe that a person's soul still lives. Right? We do believe that sometimes a person's soul knows what's going on in this world. No, he's not looking for forgiveness. We're not trying to engineer forgiveness beyond the grave. But we said that confession also humbles the person who committed the crime. And so here he has to go through that part of it. So now, what's going on here? Really, he's supposed to ask for forgiveness, and he didn't. And he's guilty for not doing it. He waited too long. We don't say, well, now that he's dead, you're a loser. Forget it. Teshuvah, you just made teshuvah impossible for yourself because you waited too long. No! You do everything that you can do now. Even though you could have done it before and should have done it before, but if you do everything that you do now, that you can do now, and this is like half of confession. It's confessing that he committed the crime without asking for forgiveness. And the same thing is true with the last words. If he owed him money, he should return it to his heirs. Now let's say he stole it from someone. So at least that person who died wanted his property to go to his heirs. And this criminal still owes it. So he's doing with it what the victim would have wanted. So that's perhaps in a extenuated sense doing what he was supposed to do. He's giving it to at least the right owners who should have that property. But what happens if he's lost? He's gone. So what he does then is he goes to the court and he says, listen, I stole this money from so-and-so. He's gone. I can't find him. I don't know how to find him. I'm giving it to you. I'm telling you who it belongs to. If it should become possible for the court to someday find him or his heirs, you have it, and please dispense it for me. Right? So he isn't doing it. He isn't doing what he's supposed to do. Return the money to the people that are supposed to get it. Because he can't. Then it's enough. Now, I mentioned to you before, but here are direct examples of it. I said that mitzvahs can be divided into two categories. And when I said it before, I changed my words. I don't want to say there are two categories of mitzvahs. It sounds like that's the way it's done. No, there are many divisions and many distinctions to be made. One of the distinctions that can be made is between mitzvahs which have many details, and any failure of any detail means you didn't do the mitzvah. You just didn't do it. Put on tefillin. Tefillin have a text in them. The text is composed of letters. If any of the letters is incorrectly formed, you haven't put on tefillin. There are 100 letters and it's only 1 out of 100. Too bad. You just haven't done it. If you discover the letter is not formed correctly, you have to go back and put on kosher tefillin because you didn't put on tefillin that day. Some mitzvahs are like that. Other mitzvahs are like charity. Let's say because of your income and your property, you're assessed to give, let's say, $1,000 a month. Lucky you, if you have that much money. And you give $500 a month. So we don't say, now listen, it was 1,000, you give 500, so the 500 is lost. You didn't fulfill the mitzvah, give 1,000 now. No, you gave $500 of charity. It was charity. It just wasn't enough. So now give another 500. So some mitzvahs, when you do part of the mitzvah, you get credit for the part that you did. Some mitzvahs you don't. What is teshuvah like? Is teshuvah like tefillin? There are certain conditions, which are in the definition of teshuvah. Those who were with us for a while know the definition. You leave one out, it's too bad. You didn't do it, go back and do it again. And in the meantime, if you don't do anything else, you've done nothing. Or is teshuvah like charity? Whatever you've done, and you get credit for it. It's just that you don't get the full benefit of teshuvah because you left something out. And the answer is that teshuvah is like charity. Every piece of teshuvah, every part of teshuvah gets you credit. It's a positive performance. It's something for which you'll earn reward. It may even earn you a lightening of the liability for the failures that you have. You just don't get the promise of having the failures wiped out, the liability for the failures wiped out entirely, which you would get if you did the entirety of teshuvah. So here we see certain things which became impossible and he doesn't do them, but he's done tshuva. Here it's even more than that. He's doing less than what is required by the definition, but because the rest has become impossible, he gets credit for the entire performance. That's an even more dramatic example of how it works. So that means that when a person sees the requirements of tshuva, and sometimes they look overwhelming, he should, like with any other mitzvah, he should subdivide it and do whatever he can to do part of the requirement. Having said that, I want to finish with a description of one of them. One of the requirements is regret. Now, regret, the Rabbi Yonah says that regret is a lifetime project. It can very well be that at a certain time you regret, and you regret sincerely, and you regret everything you know, but you might not know a lot. And as life goes on and you accumulate more information, you may feel more and more reasons for regret. So let me give you a parable. Two people are in business together. I know cases like this, unfortunately. And one steals money from the business and steals money from the other person. Well, let's say $150,000 over 6 years. And the guy doesn't notice it, or he puts it down to other causes, and he trusts his partner. And then the partner decides, it's terrible what I did. And he goes to the partner and says, listen, I'm sorry. I took the $150,000 and I owe it to you, and here it is. I'm giving it back to you, and I hope you forgive me. Now, suppose the victim says, okay, I appreciate the fact that you're giving me back the money, but I want you to know something. I used to have a gambling addiction, and I had several failures at rehabilitation. At a certain point, my wife said to me, if you go straight, I'll stay with you. But if you gamble once more, I'm leaving you. So I went straight. I went through a rehabilitation process some years ago, and since then I haven't done any gambling. But money was disappearing from the business, and she noticed that. And she asked me where the money was going. And I said, I don't know. And she says, you're lying. You're gambling again. And she left me. So you destroyed my marriage. Well, the partner who stole the money didn't know that. He just thought he was taking money. And then the other partner says, yeah, but you have to understand, a marriage is traumatic for the children. And because the marriage was destroyed, because it was a divorce, this child ended up delinquent from school, and that child ended up taking drugs. How far are the consequences of the crime? As you learn more and more about the consequences of the crime, you have more and more reason for regret. So regret becomes a constant project. Now, this is where it's interpersonal and the consequences are clear and objective and you can understand them. But there are also spiritual things that you come to understand. God is flooding the world, not flooding, He's providing the world with spiritual energy all the time. What we do has an effect on how much, what kind, and where the spiritual energy goes. When you commit a crime and you cause a stoppage of a certain flow of spiritual energy, that has consequences. All you know is you stole his money. But that had consequences for inspiration for people, or help for people, or for forgiveness for people, and so forth and so on. And God judges the society collectively. You know, there was a period in time which we are told that people worshipped idols in private. There were no public idol worship festivals, but behind the doors, in the private gardens, they worshiped people in private, idols in private. So the thought was, listen, Rabbi, right or wrong, but it's only me. And there is this fantasy in modern times that you don't punish crimes with no victims. So what you do in private shouldn't be an object of scrutiny of the law. whatever is correct about the public, about the modern law, which could certainly be questioned, but in our case, it's never the case that there are no victims. I was private, but God is making a collective judgment, let's say, on the city on the basis of the performance of everyone in the city. And everyone's performance contributes to that tally. My analogy to this is an orchestra. And an orchestra, I mean, I was a musician, so it's a natural example for me. Right? They're playing a concert, and the critic in the audience, and he's going to make a recommendation to authorities in Europe whether to take this orchestra for a tour of performances in Europe. And it comes to the last note in a C major composition, and the oboe is to play the middle note of E natural. One oboist says, I'm playing E flat. I'm playing a different note. So, it plays, it's awful, and they come to him and he says, I'm only one player. There are 80 of you. You played your notes, I played my notes. No, but you ruined the performance for the other 79. You didn't make them do something, you didn't push them, you didn't cheat them, but your performance of your own ruined the outcome for the other 79. So in our case, there's no such thing as a private crime, a crime with no victim. Indirectly, every crime has some effect on other people. So when you assess the significance of what you're doing, you have to take the social context into account. You can't avoid that. At any rate, so that's the idea of confession in great detail. This was the end of chapter 2. In Yeshivat Hashem, today is Tuesday, right? So in Yeshivat Hashem, tomorrow we'll start chapter 3, and we'll carry on.